As we're moving through the study of James, we're asking this huge question: what does it take to find faith that actually works? Not just a faith that kind of swirls and swills around nebulously in our lives, an idea of nice beliefs that hopefully make us a better person, but what would it take to actually find a faith in Jesus that works, that is solid, substantive, and secure, that anchors your very identity, and that directs you with a hope and a future that is stronger and more rich and alive than anything you could have imagined? This is the question we are bringing to the book of James. And in order to get there, what James has inevitably surfaced over and over again already in these first two chapters, that is going to steer straight into in chapter 3, is the power of words. But here's my concern. I think sometimes words for us can become sort of a trite, religious, superficial exercise. I don't know about you. I grew up in the church. I was around the youth group. It felt like all readings of James ended up in this moralizing, where the only thing we were really told to do was stop gossiping. Don't say bad things about Ricky, because Ricky's feelings are going to get hurt. And if Ricky's feelings are hurt, then you probably are a bad person who doesn't really love God. That approach to words, while important, surely, doesn't get into the richness of Hebrew thinking when it comes to the power of words. In fact, I was most struck by this as I was moving through academic studies, realizing that the true revolution that took place in the 20th century, the revolution that most philosophers would say shifted us from a modernism era, an era of truth and enlightenment and scientific method, into an era that now is called either postmodernism or late modernism, was a revolution around our understanding of words themselves, often called the linguistic turn. He was one of my favorite characters, a guy named Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein, very fun German name to say. And Wittgenstein started with this work called the Tractatus that was scientific, it was logical, it was an exercise in which he laid out mathematical formulas and structures that persist to this very day for those who follow the work that he put together in the Tractatus. I would not claim to be smart enough to understand the Tractatus. Everyone who read it marveled at this young person. Wittgenstein was, I think, 29 when he wrote the Tractatus, who was putting together a logical structure and vision of reality. But here's the interesting thing. As Wittgenstein pondered his work, he was actually too intelligent to stop with his Tractatus. And if you're paying close attention to this, this is truly the revolution that shook the foundations of Western society and created what is often called postmodernism. Wittgenstein saw that underneath his logic, underneath his science, underneath his structuralism, were words themselves. Words themselves were the building block of all thought, of all rationality, of all understanding, truth, life. Now, I realize this is a very big thought, but take just a moment to consider this way closer to the ground. When it comes to your life, when it comes to your relationship to those closest to you, your family, your roommates, your friends, what do you use to solidify an understanding of that relationship? You use words, right? It is words themselves that clarify that that man who has been there in your life since the beginning is in fact your father. That woman who has grown up alongside you, it is in fact your sister. That person that happens to share a room in your apartment building is in fact your roommate and not in fact a stranger or a house sitter or somebody who just happened to wander into your building, right? Words solidify relationship. Words also are used to power our very thinking and understanding itself. This is what Wittgenstein gets into with his philosophical investigations. His most famous work that arguably upended everything he had created earlier with his Tractatus. In Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein notes, all of our words are being used to solidify the relationship, not only that we have with each other, but our relationship with all of life around us. There was this famous children's young adult story that I just thought was great when I was a young kid. It was a book that came out in 1996, shows how old I am. It was called Frindle. And in this story, in Frindle, the author tells of a young boy, a middle schooler, who takes a pen and upon hearing the power of language, starts to say with his friends that this is no longer a pen. We declare that this is now called a Frindle. And of course, this student's teacher hates this because the student is undermining language, undermining the ability to share and participate in a common reality, a common rule, basically, where this object that you hold in your hand it's a pen. That's what English declares this object to be. But here is a young 8th grade boy declaring this instead to be a Frindle. And yet in the story, he gets onto the news, and as he gets onto the news, everyone starts to adopt this wonderful, delightful word, Frindle, as an exercise in experimenting with what we know something to be. And finally, at the end of the story, spoiler alert, just in case you didn't get to read it in 1996, the boy receives a note that Frindle has become a part of the dictionary, solidifying its position as a newly coined, newly named reality that was not in existence before. Now, what I experienced as a rather delightful trite exercise in the power of 8th grade imagination and thinking, Wittgenstein would say gives clarity to the relationship words have to all meaning, all reality, all of life. For his part, Wittgenstein was a philosopher, and for his contributions in the philosophical investigations into the power of language, almost all the rest of 20th century thought, well now into the 21st century, would be dominated by philosophers rethinking the posture, the status of our relationship to words. However, some of the argument from Christians around Wittgenstein is that the Bible has long pointed to the power of our words to create worlds. This actually is a phrase from the Jewish philosopher Abraham Heschel. He said it in an offhanded remark. What I love about this insight is that it's deeply biblical in its imagination, that to go all the way back to the creation itself in Genesis 1, how does God create? God speaks, saying, "Let us make," and then it comes to be. Our Creator God, from the very beginning, saw words as the very building blocks of creation itself. This is why when Adam in the garden is told to name the animals, he is inheriting the very creative potential of God to name, to identify, to steward the creation that God has made. And when, of course, we get to the Gospels, what are we told in John? It is the Word, the Logos, that becomes flesh and that shows us the full glory and truth of God. All of this preamble to say, as we turn now to James 3, we're going to find one of the most famous passages in the New Testament on the power of words. What I want to encourage you to consider is why James's instruction on words, not just morals, they're not just trite or superficial encouragement to stop gossiping or to be kind to Ricky or Lizzie's feelings. Instead, James is helping us tap into the very essence of life, the very power of God to create, to identify, to restructure. And what James is going to warn us is that if we, as Christians, wield this power negligently, it is going to cause devastation and destruction. Words wielded poorly will pull apart the very fabric of life, but words stewarded well will begin to recreate or will begin to build up the very new life and new love that God intended. So if we're going to find a faith that works, let's turn with James to James 3 to see what he has to say about the power of our words themselves. Let's go ahead and look at James 3, starting in verse 1. "Not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. We all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. Now, this is a little bit of a turn for James, although James has been focused on the church. You might recall in the previous chapter when James is walking through James 2, how James is giving really clear instruction to the leaders, to the community, that if they prioritize the rich, and if they neglect the poor, then they are going to be depicting an inversal of the very humbling work that God is intending to move through and the very proud that God is intending to resist. So perhaps with that in mind, James turns his attention to the teachers, although there's been some discussion in the commentaries that while James notes teachers, he's not necessarily saying preachers in the church. There's some debate around how solidified a preacher, quote unquote, was in the early church at this point. I mean, it's probable, if you're imagining this early church setting, that you're in a house model, normally like large homes, therefore wealthy patrons of the community, maybe invited you in to sit at their table, which would have been, a frequent place of banqueting, being able to host a large meal. This is why it was so important that if wealthy people are walking into the home, they're being prioritized, whereas if the poor are walking in, they're being neglected. This table is not right. This is not the table of Jesus that Jesus intended to depict. But normally as the meal would progress, following Jewish customs, at some point, psalms, if they had them, would be sung or perhaps read. And then normally an elder, a presbyter, a leader of some kind from within the community, would be asked to comment on the scriptures that had been read to be able to point towards Jesus, right? So that is probably the background of what James is getting at. But I think just more broadly, it's helpful to think any of us who inhabit a teaching profession, clearly professional ministers today, yes, but also those who are actually teachers, those who are parents, those who are leaders in their industry, those who are presenting at workshops, speaking at conferences, really anyone who assumes this mantle of responsibility, James is saying, should be careful with their words. And he actually puts pressure on this concept of perfection. Now, this is a very rabbinic Jewish way of doing things. James is like, if you can't do it perfectly, be aware that you could fail at this miserably. I think sometimes when we read this in English, we're so unaccustomed to this Jewish holism in which the whole thing works together. The whole thing needs to retain its perfection, its integrity, its blemishlessness, that we feel pressure. We're like, I'm sure my teaching, whatever my teaching is, I'm sure it's not perfect. The point isn't really to try to hit James literally on the head here and say, if a teacher stumbles, if one word is out of line, then your whole ministry, your whole teaching should be off. No, that's not what James is getting at. What James is instead trying to see is this responsibility of leveraging words on behalf of instructing others is elevated because of the whole bounded set of consequences that could result if this is done poorly. If we keep going, James turns to one of his most famous runs of imagery. He says, when we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we can turn the whole animal. Or take ships as an example. Although they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are steered by a very small rudder wherever the pilot wants to go. There's two simple images here that are really straightforward. In fact, I think this is James at his finest. This is one of the reasons why James is a fun book to read. James is a preacher. He knows you need to picture it. You got to get tactile in what you're thinking. He notes first, the tongue is like a bit in a horse's mouth. There's actually some fun wordplay in the Greek that when James says the small thing can steer the whole animal, the word for animal, soma, is literally the same word that you would use for a human body. There's clearly a double entendre going on here. James is saying the bit steering the horse is the same bit that steers the whole of our bodies. as we move and be and relate and connect to others in the world. The second image James is going to use is that of a ship, saying much like a small rudder that is able to steer the forces of the ship, the tongue is what allows you to navigate the currents of life. I actually love this image in particular, because if you picture a ship, I mean, most of us are probably not spending a ton of time on boats. A ship is heavy. A ship, of course, does float, but a ship is within a mass. Like, you think of water and how heavy water is. If you've ever even picked up an extra large bucket and just felt the mass of water, you've got this huge ship, which is, in this image, ourselves, within this even greater mass of weight, which is water, like the whole of the ocean, the whole of the sea just spread out. And there on the ship is this one small piece of material, this one strip of wood that, as it is turned, is able to direct this immense object, to cut through this even more immense object. When it comes to our own lives, is it possible, and I mean, just really sit with this for a minute, is it possible that words, the power of your words, the power even of your thoughts, the silent words that you are allowing to flow through and to shape your mind, are words the rudder that could either allow you to navigate the weight, the pressures, the immensity of just the sea of life that is around you? Like, life is so overwhelming. There's so many challenges. There's so many obstacles that you're facing. There's so many elements of our news cycle, of politics, of TikTok, and information that's just flowing over you. Are words the rudder that could allow you to navigate that immense body of water? Or are words the very thing that could pull, reshape, direct you towards destruction? This is where James is building. In fact, let's keep reading. Likewise, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. This turn by James uses one last vivid image. It's like you can almost see the wheels turning in James's head as he's thinking through a horse with this bit, a boat that's navigating the ocean. The third is then a spark, a small, tiny spark that can set a whole forest ablaze. We, tragically, the last few years, have seen more wildfires than I feel like I ever saw growing up. This image feels pertinent to us. And yet, where James is really directing the force of this image is towards the destruction that your words, the spark of your words, can have on yourself. In fact, he's going to say the power of your words can set your whole body aflame. And it's almost like James, in this natural spiral of imagery, goes from your body to the destruction, power of your words, to the very fires of hell itself. This is one of the very few occurrences of the term Gehenna in the New Testament. I do love that Gehenna has this root outside of Jerusalem in the dumpster pit. It's literally this pit outside of the city that was tragically associated in the Old Testament as a valley where children would be sacrificed to foreign gods. And as time went on, because this was such a desecrated, it was viewed as such a unholy site, it was where Jerusalem began to gather their garbage to be burned. So as Jesus refers to Gehenna, and as James likely is a pastor in Jerusalem, ministering from within Jerusalem, he points to this pit, this valley, this dumpster fire, quite literally, and says, when your words go misdirected, they are like a spark that not only can set a whole forest on fire, but set your very soul on fire until it is burning like the trash that is burning out there in Gehenna, in hell. Now, when I think about my own life, when I think of what James is getting at here, there have been only a few moments where I felt myself standing there in front of another person having a conflict, having a conversation that really mattered. I felt myself occasionally in my marriage, felt myself as a parent to my own children, in relationship to my own family. I felt these moments where my words were carrying such weight that I could, as I look back, see the trajectory of the consequences of these words, that they would form divots in the ground where the sparks would be able to grow, and that just a simple fanning of that flame could actually destroy, crumble the very relationship itself, even begin to set fire to my very own soul. James is going to end this rather bleak, very gripping account of the danger of our words by saying this: all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. Now, interestingly, that final line there, did you catch? It is a restless evil. That term, restless, is the same term that we highlighted in James 1 about the double-mindedness, the double-souledness that causes a person to be restless and unstable. This term restless, I think, is actually at the heart of what James is offering pastoral instruction to us in. The great challenge I think James is trying to set up for us is that there are churning forces, churning desires within us that, when unchecked, are going to pull and push, and they're going to actually cause restlessness, this great heaving, almost like an ocean whose waves are being whipped up because of the storm that the sea is in. Our hearts carry restlessness within us. This is the great Augustine line that I've highlighted before. We are restless creatures. And so James is saying something here that commentaries have tried to walk back. They've tried to sort of soften. James is basically saying, with the tongue, you're never going to, in fact, be able to tame the evil, the brokenness, the destruction that the chaotic, restless forces of churning emotions within you are going to cause. Now, I, as ever with James, don't know exactly what to do with him here on this point. One of my favorite insights comes from Augustine, who, reading James on this line, points out that it is impossible for us as humanity, if it's impossible for man to tame our own hearts so that our words can be directed clearly, then that impossibility requires us to need God to come in to sort out and sift through the restless, churning, double-souledness within us in order that God could redirect our words towards praise and confession in Him. I think there's maybe an insight here for us to ask, what words are trustworthy for our souls? What words are helpful when it comes to redirecting our souls? Augustine is probably right that some combination of confession and praise are the only ways to pull our hearts out of the restlessness that they're experiencing and to realign us once again towards God. But I can't help but wonder if some of the force of what James is getting at here is if nothing else, just a simple caution. Like, James is trying to box us into a corner to avoid the hubris of ever thinking that you or that I am able to fully control the words that we will unleash onto the world. Your words, when spoken, matter. Your words, when spoken, create worlds. James is maybe just trying to tell you, if nothing else, know that there is a restless churning inside. That means that whether you want it or not, your words will and can often cause destruction, often be experienced as evil, can even operate like a poison that settles in, and long after you didn't intend, long after you no longer meant those words that you were speaking, their effects can linger. The fire can still grow. In fact, there may even now be those, as you hear this instruction from James, that your heart is pulled towards asking, do I need to continue to go back and undo the devastation, attempt to undo the devastation that the destruction of my words have caused. This logic from James flows into a couple more images. He's going to turn in the following section and say, with the tongue we praise our Lord and Father, and with it we curse human beings who have been made in God's likeness. Out of the same mouth come praise and cursing. My brothers and sisters, this should not be. Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water. I think here James has hit a nice rabbinic cycle. He's refreshing ideas he's already prepped. He's giving slightly new nuances and twists. He goes through a nice run by highlighting the same vessel, the same heart, the same soul that is intended to be praising God is tearing down those in God's image. Now, if that is not cause to pause how we use social media, how we critique those who we view as other or different than us, then I don't know what other verse is. However, without belaboring the point, James keeps going. Just like salt water and fresh water cannot flow through the same spring. I mean, if you introduce salt water into a freshwater stream, it will kill the plants. It will kill what you're trying to produce. Likewise, these convoluted words are flowing out of the same heart. Final image James is going to produce is this sort of agricultural fig and olive tree imagery. It makes one think of Jesus and Jesus' words. Jesus himself, of course, gestures at saying, out of the heart comes the words of the mouth. Jesus warns the Pharisees, if your heart is unclean, what you produce is going to be unclean. All of this to me gestures at a preacher who's just trying to, with forceful, vivid, relatable imagery, get his community to see you are a mess of double-mindedness. You are producing mixed fruit. You are being the hypocrisy and the lack of integrity that you long to see corrected in the world. Like if your faith isn't working, if you're looking for a faith that works, you do have to start with yourself and acknowledge, I am producing the same mixed bag of double-souledness, double-mindedness that is like salt water flowing in with fresh water into a stream. It is causing these mixed results. I think the only relief that James is going to offer us here comes in the final section where James is going to point us back to God. So here's where James goes. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. James turns us once more to wisdom. If you remember, James has been building this case, a theological case, that wisdom comes from God. Wisdom is, in fact, wise words. The whole essence of wisdom is one who can cultivate their words to create life rather than to create destruction. In fact, if you read Proverbs closely, Proverbs is fascinated as a book of wisdom with the power of our words, also with the power of creation itself. And James clearly is weaving something together here, which he's trying to say, like, if you're going to be sorted out, if your double-souledness is going to be sorted out, you've got to stop relying on yourself for your own wisdom, and you need to instead seek it from God. Notice the couple of huge detractors James is going to notice can pull you from wisdom that God could give. He mentions envy. He mentions bitterness. He mentions selfish ambition in your heart. He mentions boasting. He mentions denying the truth. For James, these postures of words, which are in fact a reversal or denial of the posture of wisdom, submission, prayer for wisdom that you're meant to be seeking, these postures are evil, they're unspiritual, they're demonic, and he's noting they're going to cause more and more restless churning within you. They're going to bring about the very disorder that this whole instruction from James has been trying to sort out. Here's how James closes. He says, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. I think the closing thought from James here is to return to this Jewish sense of holism. James is trying to get you to see the characteristics of wisdom, the characteristics of words that create life, as opposed to words that are going to pull apart, cause destruction. And what James is gesturing at is that one of the best markers of wise words are words that are full of peace. Notice how peace exudes from this description of wisdom that is coming down from heaven. This makes sense that if our relationship with God requires a word from Jesus to make right that relationship, if it is in fact the word of God, Jesus Christ, that makes peace with us, as the Apostle Paul would say, then we need to receive that word, and it will be marked, it will be noted, it will be expressed in our lives through words of peace that flow from us. Notice that agricultural image where in the previous section, James is gesturing at grounds that cannot grow, at fig trees that are not bearing olives, and this sort of confusion and mixture of a double-souled production, words that flow both towards life and away from it. By contrast, James points towards a peacemaker who sows in peace a harvest of righteousness. This is one whose words, having been made peace with God through the word of Jesus, is now able to plant words of peace into the soil and produce righteousness as a result. Now here's my thing with James 3. I've mentioned at almost every point of this study, I find James to be hard. James is challenging. James is hitting us right where it hurts, giving really blunt assessments and clear directives for areas of our lives that, if James is right, are almost impossible to control. I am humbled as I read James 3, that at some point my words will produce poison instead of life. My words have caused devastation, have sparked fires that I never intended, and that rather than seeing across my life all of these beautiful gardens that have been planted from words of peace, I instead see these craters, these pockets of destructions where words, whether ill-used, unintended, or anything else, have left this incredible devastation as a result. However, I do think James has been building this overarching case here, that if you can begin with confession, if you can begin by acknowledging your own restless churnings within, you can begin to pay attention and seek to receive peace from the one who is able to speak a word of life to you. Is it possible? Is it possible that the word of Jesus, either read through your scriptures, encountered through prayer, or simply listened to in quiet moments throughout your day, is it possible that that word of peace is intended to speak to your heart in an ongoing way so that those restless waters, restless churning could actually be stilled? I could almost see Augustine playing with the scriptures, saying something like, for any of us who feel the despair of our restless hearts that continue to churn out restless words, can you invite Jesus to come, walk on those waters, enter into the most quiet, intimate spaces within your soul, and speak that word of peace that you so desperately need to hear? Could that still the waters long enough to allow you to begin to draw forth new words yourself, new words of peace that you are able to sow into the relationships of your life, new words of blessing that you're able to extend out to those even who are far away? Is it possible that even today you could take one text, one encounter, one interaction? I think right now of my daughter who I sent to school this morning, who I had a chance to slow down with, and yet who I so easily can miss. Could I, in that moment, enter into an encounter where I see her, I still the waters, the restless waters inside, enough to extend to her a word of peace that could then linger in her own heart with the power of God's Spirit in a way that I could never attempt through my own effort to accomplish on my own. May you become the kind of person who, because of the word of peace that has been spoken to you, you are able to sow words of peace in others. This has been John Prine with The Burning Word. Grace and peace.